Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. It gives me great pleasure to converse with the great Tom Holland today. And we're going to be talking about this book. I think you all know who Tom is, but this is his third in his Roman trilogy. He started with Caesar, then Dynasty, the first emperors of the Caesar family. And now this book goes from Nero to Hadrian, who might be one of your favorite emperors. We're going to talk about a lot about emperors.
Yep.
Yeah. We're going to obviously this is really about discussing really serious matters like the constitutions of provincial Roman towns and colonies versus
tax
the
reforms.
magistracy of ancient Rome, the role of consuls, the Senate, the composition of the Senate, the nature of slavery in ancient Roman world, and other questions, and race in the ancient Roman world, all those sort of things. But let's begin with probably the deepest and gravest and the most solemn question I can really ask, which is, if you were on Love Island, which Roman emperor would you choose to be with?
Well, that would depend. Was I in the mood for fun? And if I were, what kind of fun?
Yes.
If I were in the mood for no-holds-barred fun, do you know, I'd take a punt on Nero.
I knew it. I knew it.
I can imagine it going horribly wrong, but when I came out, my profile on TikTok would be off the scale.
But you might.
However, suppose I don't want to get into trouble. My wife is here, for instance.
Yeah.
I might choose to go with Galba, who succeeds Nero, on the basis that he's incredibly dull and very much a man for a cold shower.
Yes.
So it depends, you've got to work out your media strategy, haven't you?
I was very insulted about Galba, because when he was beheaded, they couldn't hold up his head because he was bald.
Yeah.
So they held his head by sticking their thumb in his mouth.
Yeah.
So this book is, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, you must read this book. It's absolutely superb, unputdownable, full of flights of Hollandian wit, and all sorts of things you need to know about Roman emperors, like, for example, the fact that the nicknames of Roman emperors. Like, for example, the fact that Vitellius was widely known as Sphincter. Maybe you can explain why that is the case.
Again and again, when I've talked about this book, I've found myself going down conversational cul-de-sacs and realizing about 30 seconds before I arrive at the crash point where I am heading. So there's and it chiefly revolves around the fact that Roman attitudes to sex are very radically different to ours. And I would say that for us, there's the polarity, the binary, is based around gender. But by and large, certainly if you're a Roman male, a free male, the polarity is around Roman free males and everybody else. And as a Roman free male, you were allowed to do what you like, essentially, with your membrum virile. What you're not allowed to do is to allow the membrum virile to go up your sphincter. And if you do that, or even if you are kind of accused of it, the stain of it will attach itself to you for the rest of your life. And Vitellius, as a youth, was on the island of Capri with Tiberius, and the very fact of his presence there meant that from that point on he would have this kind of taint that he had been used by Tiberius, and so the Romans never ever let a scandal go to sleep.
Well, I mean, Tiberius's palace in Capri had a very famous swimming pool, a bit like Clifton, didn't it?
Yes. And
perhaps you could
yeah. So yes, it even puts the scandalous reputation of the swimming pool here at Clifton to in second place. Yes. So Tiberius, it was said, employed young boys to swim alongside him and lick and nibble at his private parts. And I don't think Profumo did that, did he? Or
No, I don't think he did. Weren't they known as the minnows?
they were.
Yes.
Yes, Simon,
but
they were.
anyway, before we get on to serious matters, we're not. This is not the sort of level we're going to travel at all times.
Right, I know. So,
So I'm
sure
I
lots of
think-
people have just been listening to Mary talking about how
Yes.
all the Roman emperors ever do is, their tax forms and, filling out papers and things like that. And here we are on minnows in swimming pools and sphincters.
She was saying that gossip is very important because it shows the nature of secret power.
It does.
Which is why we're able to discuss these things.
Yes.
Under at
Okay,
least the
as long as
cloak-
that's clear.
Under the cloak of virtue, Roman virtue. And so, while we're on that serious matter, one of the things that I find most fascinating in the book is that it is a mixture of high and low. And one of the things that I was most curious about was when you read the letters of Trajan, for example, probably the greatest Roman emperor.
Well, discuss.
To discuss.
I mean, the Romans thought
Yeah,
that. He
the
was
Romans
the
thought that. What do
Optimus
you think?
Princeps, the best. No, I mean, he ends up becoming a very bad emperor because he invades Iraq. And we all know that
overextends.
invading Iraq is a terrible thing to do. And his reign ends in kind of disaster.
Yeah.
And it's left to Hadrian to clear up the mess, which he does very effectively.
But what I liked was his kind of quite matter-of-fact correspondence. And, it really reminded me of what's happening now with the sort of the rail link, the HS2 rail link,
Yes.
where he says, there's one bit where he says, I mean, maybe you can remember it, where he kind of exclaims with outrage about the expense of some huge
Yes.
engineering scheme. Do you remember the
So
letter? I'm putting you slightly on the spot.
Yes,
here.
I think it's an aqueduct that they're trying to build, and the first one collapses, and the second one doesn't work, and the third one, he's going, for God's sake, can't they sort this out? And it is absolutely very, very familiar.
Yeah, he says something like, how can they spend these eye-watering sums on this one engineering enterprise?
So I think that is the fascination, I think, for us of the Roman world, is that again and again there are moments like that where we feel that there are contemporaries, where you think, oh yes, moaning about an infrastructure project that's got out of control or something like that. But it exists in the context of a world that is also unfathomably alien. And so alien that it can actually take a kind of effort of will to appreciate just how alien they were. And that conjunction of the very familiar and the unfathomably strange, I think that for us it gives something of the quality of science fiction to reading about this period. And that for me I think has always been the fascination of it.
But to move on to writing history, isn't that the sort of great challenge of writing history? Not to impose the present on the past, and secondly, to be humble, have the humility to realise how little we understand these people and how unlike us they were.
Well, so my perspective on that has definitely changed over the course of writing about the Romans. So my first book, Rubicon, which was about Julius Caesar and the age of the last years of the Republic, I was writing that against the backdrop of 9/11 and the build-up to the Iraq War. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a lot of stuff in the newspapers then, kind of, endless cartoons of George Bush as Caesar with kind of laurel wreaths and things. And of course, he was gearing up to invade Iraq. And this idea of an imperial republic with kind of military machine that it could launch against uppity autocrats in the Near East, it seemed very, very familiar. And I gave my chapter titles, there was Known Unknowns, there was War on Terror, all kinds of things like that. And I consciously made play with the echoes and the parallels of what was going on in the world while I was writing that book. But I don't think I would do that now, because over the past 20 years, I've just come to a kind of ever profounder sense of how strange the Romans are. And as I say, the parallels, I think, really serve only to heighten and highlight a sense of how very distant they are, how very strange. And so my ambition in this book really is to try and bring that to life, is to portray them in what I think is as being their strangeness, so that by the end of the book, you may still feel that they are terrifying and that their kind of moral frameworks are very, very frightening. But at the same time, you understand that they did have moral frameworks. They did have, they functioned according to their own rhythms, their own morals, their own laws, their own assumptions, their own presumptions, and that these were very different from ours.
And yet, more, polls show that more and more, particularly in America, but also here, everyone is obsessed with Roman emperors.
Well, American men, supposedly.
American men.
So I'm sure people have picked up on this. Again, it's kind of something on TikTok, I think, that an American woman asked her husband, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And he said, I don't know, maybe 3 times a week. Yeah. And she kind of posted this and said, what? What's going? And everyone piled in and said, well, I think about it 4 times a day.
Yes. Which is very good for your book, of course.
Tremendous. Well, it was all a viral marketing campaign.
Did you invent it?
Yeah.
But it's like Zuckerberg says that he thinks that he wants to be Augustus.
Yes, which is terrifying. A terrifying insight. So it have nothing to do with Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called. No. If he wants to be Augustus.
Yeah.
His sister is a very distinguished classicist.
Really? Yeah. So why are those there's a sort of run of Caesars from Julius Caesar himself to, I guess, to Marcus Aurelius or Commodus that we are strangely familiar with because of films. And everyone identifies with them. And then, of course, there's gladiators. So there's a sort of weird part of modern machismo that craves Roman violence, I guess.
So Commodus, of course, son of Marcus Aurelius, runs into Russell Crowe, which is,
a good thing. It's a good thing for
it's a good thing for Rome, but it's a bad thing for Commodus.
Yeah.
And he is seen as the bad emperor who ends the Golden Age, and who therefore is really the first emperor who features in Gibbon's Decline and Fall. So he is the kind of start point for the Decline and Fall, according to Gibbon. But I think that the challenge of looking at this succession of emperors from Caesar through to Commodus is firstly, and this is very much what kind of Mary's book is about, her new book, is to say, well, do they really change? Is there much change? Is there much progression? Can you look at the institution of being an emperor in its entirety, or is there kind of evolution over the course of that period? But also there is the sense that I think the reason why certainly the earlier emperors are best known, and the reason why they kind of feed into novels and films and TV series, is because we do have all these scandalous records. So we have Tacitus, who is the greatest Roman historian, writes about the family of Augustus, so the Caesars who follow him by kind of a line of descent or adoption. But then he also writes about what happens when Nero, who is the last of Augustus's lineal descendants, dies, and the question then is raised: well, who should rule? Should anyone rule? And if someone is going to rule, on what basis should they rule? And so he writes about them, and then right the way up to Domitian, who is the second son of the last of the 4 emperors who in AD 69 are fighting to make themselves Caesar. So you then have, including Julius Caesar, who is not generally counted as an emperor, you have the 12 Caesars. And what you have with them is kind of details about their hair. So kind of details of hair are actually incredibly important for understanding image and things like that. Sex,
Well, Trajan's hairdo is one of the, Trajan's hairdo and Hadrian's beard, his Greekling beard. I mean,
so receding hairlines.
Very dangerous. Very dangerous.
Well, so Domitian, the last of the emperors who is discussed by Suetonius, a deeply unpleasant man, a charmless man, and treated with vituperation by those emperors who follow him, but a very, very able man. He, on his coins, portrays himself with kind of Timotei-style locks, kind of flowing, gorgeous, he's worth it, all that kind of thing. But the thing that gossips in the court are always saying is he's paranoid about going bald. And to the extent that the rumour is that anyone mentions baldness, he immediately goes out of favour. So there's this tension between the reality of Domitian and the way that he's promoting himself. But the thing is that Trajan's exactly the same. So if you think of the busts of Trajan, he's got this kind of pudding bowl, and This is the hairstyle of a soldier, a vir militaris, a man who goes out and camps out in tents and kills barbarians and, you know, upholds the traditional martial virtues of the ancient Romans when they embarked on their imperial adventure. And he's making a statement to the Roman people that, look at me, I despise kind of teased hairstyles, I despise fashion, I'm a plain rough soldier. But Pliny the Younger, the guy who Trajan is kind of endlessly writing his letters to, and who as a young man had famously seen the eruption of Vesuvius, Pliny the Younger lets slip in a eulogy, which it's incredibly long. I mean, Pliny, he doesn't read the whole thing, but if he had, it would have probably taken him about 6 hours. But in the course of this eulogy, Pliny lets slip the fact that Trajan has a receding hairline as well. And Pliny says very suavely that this is a gift from the gods to demonstrate his maturity. But when you look at Trajan's portrait busts, there's no hint of that. So actually, Trajan and Domitian are not that dissimilar. No. And Trajan is really, he's kind of continuity Domitian.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting things about this book is your sort of secret rehabilitation of Domitian. He comes out as
he's a horrible man.
He's a horrible man,
but horrible
efficient.
Men get things done.
And he's efficient and he gets things done. And this is the most positive account of Domitian I've ever read.
Well, what I kept thinking when so Domitian exists in the context of a series of disasters that has overwhelmed the Roman world. So one of them I already mentioned, the Year of the Four Emperors, which follows the suicide of Nero, when essentially it's an attempt to answer this question, what is it that makes an emperor? And the answer had always been staring people in plain view, but now it becomes absolutely unignorable, is that what makes an emperor is having a large quantity of battle-hardened legions at your back. And so these 4 emperors who follow each other in succession over the course of AD 69 are kind of tearing the empire to pieces. And that's a terrible thing. The Romans have not experienced civil war for about a century, and now there are people who genuinely fear that the entire empire is going to implode. The guy who emerges from that, Vespasian, is a very effective, very solid emperor. He rules for 10 years, but then he's succeeded by his son Titus, who I know that you've written about in your book Jerusalem, because he is the man, of course, who sacks Jerusalem and destroys the temple with momentous long-term.
A very bad man.
Well, we'll come to him in a minute, perhaps. But in his reign, you get even more disasters. So you get a terrible plague. You get the most sacred temple in the Roman world, the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol, burning down for the second time within a decade, because it had also burnt down in AD 69. And of course, most famously, you get the eruption of Vesuvius, which
you do brilliantly in the book, by the way, which is fantastic. It's worth reading. I mean, it is actually the centre of the book. Ironically, even though it's about emperors in one sense, Pompeii, you use Pompeii as a brilliant way to describe Roman society. And
well, it does, yes, because it enables us to see what's going on outside Rome. Yeah. So it is incredibly useful. But from the point of view of the kind of the making sense of Domitian, what it also does is to leave large numbers of people in Pompeii and Herculaneum unburied. So they haven't had their funeral rites. So their ghosts have to be imagined as roaming the Bay of Naples. And so this endless succession of disasters, in Domitian's opinion, can only mean one thing, which is that the gods have not been receiving their proper dues. Because for the Romans, the relationship of mortals to the divine is a bit like a kind of holidaymaker to the insurance company. If you don't pay your dues and things go wrong, then you're not going to get any protection. So I think that Domitian's whole motivation is to try and re-establish the proper religiones, as they call them, the bonds that join humanity to the heavens. And to do that, he forces the Roman people and the empire beyond to take tough medicine. And that's what he's doing. And he feels that he is appointed by the god, that it's destiny that has put him in this place. And he does not hesitate to call himself Dominus, Lord, Master, which is a word that Augustus had deliberately refused to use because it was so offensive to the kind of the traditional republican sense that the Roman people were a free people. But Domitian tramples on that because he feels that the times require it. It's his mission to do everything that he has to do. So he is like a dominus, a master of a familia, a household. It's his responsibility to set them on the right footing. And if that involves treading on people's toes, then so be it, and offending people.
So to go back to Nero, who is another emperor condemned to universal damnation after his downfall, though he did have quite a few pretenders, didn't he? I mean, he was quite popular among a certain sort of person.
I mean, Nero very pointedly and deliberately, in a kind of punk style, offends the traditional elites, the traditional power brokers. And unfortunately for his posthumous reputation, they are the people who write the histories.
And I mean, and yet, to read about his rule, you'd think it was just such a disaster. He was almost immediately over. He was in power for 15 years, wasn't he?
Well, I mean, the thing is the histories of Nero's reign that we have, relying on them would be a bit like, for a future historian, relying solely on the New York Times or editorials on the CNN to understand Trump. You have to understand, the whole point of Nero is that really he's making a pitch over the heads of the traditional elites.
I mean,
very like Trump.
Trump seems a very Neronian character.
Up to a point.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he's not. I mean, even Trump hasn't
murdered his mother.
Murdered his mother, or
or slept with his mother,
or castrated a boy who looks like Melania.
Okay, wait a sec. We need to come. Since we're on that subject now, we're on. Mm-hmm. It's time we talked about Poppaea Sabina, his wife.
Yes, the most fashionable woman in Rome.
The fashionable woman in Rome, yeah. who also was very fascinated with Jewish customs.
Yes,
and which was also very fashionable at that time, and whose death may be kicked in the stomach by Nero.
Yeah, so the story is that that Nero comes back late from the races, and Poppaea nags him, and he kicks her in the stomach, and she's carrying his unborn baby, maybe his unborn son, and dies. I think this is improbable. Of course, the fact that the story is told tells you everything about Nero's reputation with a certain class of person. But I think the salient factor in Nero's relationship to Poppaea is that she is the love of his life. Considering his reputation, he actually seems to have been very uxorious. Not to his first wife, who he had executed, so that he could.
Very uxorious.
But this was so he could marry Poppaea. So it's actually very touching.
Yeah, very touching.
Very sweet. But the reason he's obsessed with Poppaea is that she kind of, you mentioned, we began with Love Island. She is the ultimate influencer. She has her own cosmetics brand. It's Poppaea, not Cleopatra, who is supposed to have bathed in ass's milk to preserve her complexion. And Poppaea has this very, very striking hair, which Nero, in poetry that has survived, praises as being amber-coloured. And Nero is so obsessed by this colour of hair that he sends agents off to Scandinavia to source amber so that he can then use it to decorate, theatres and public displays and things. And this generates an incredible fashion among women in Rome, of course, to look like Poppaea. And then the question is, well, how can you dye your hair to make it kind of blonder, lighter, like Poppaea's hair? And fortunately, there's this tremendous shampoo that comes from Batavia, which is an island in the mouth of the Rhine and furnishes Rome with the best auxiliaries in the empire. But this soap is a kind of compound of fat and ash and dung, and it sounds awful. But it's kind of rolled into a ball and gets sent to Rome. And a very, very, a skillful hairdresser can use it to dye the hair and kind of make it amberish and Poppaea coloured. The drawback, and I apologise for this, the drawback is that it can turn you bald.
Yeah. No need to apologise.
So, and I think that kind of wonderfully exemplifies the constant challenge that people face when they're trying to control their image, is that you could end up with kind of wonderful amber-coloured hair, or you could end up with all your hair falling out. You have to, it's a fine line that you're treading all the time, even if you're an emperor. Emperors have to be aware
especially
yes,
emperors.
maybe even especially.
It's like there hasn't for years been a bald president of America, for the same reasons. It's all image. Anyway, but the point is that so Poppaea dies, and now we need to introduce everyone to one of the most intriguing and fascinating characters in the whole of your book, who was both a sort of a plaything, a victim, a mascot.
Yes, so Nero, so Poppaea is dead. Nero gives her an absolutely brilliant send-off, absolutely sumptuous. And then he marries again, a kind of smart, aristocratic woman who I think was, pretty much his type. But the drawback with this third wife is that she doesn't look like Poppaea. And Nero aches to be in bed with Poppaea. And so therefore he does what anyone would do in his situation, which is to send agents out across the world to try and find someone who looks like Poppaea. And they duly find someone. The twist is that this person is not a girl, but a boy, a young boy. And so again, Nero does what anyone would in that situation, which is to take the boy and castrate him.
And what does he call him?
So he's called two things. He's called Poppaea because he has the full makeover, the blonde, the amber hair and the makeup and the cosmetics and the, everything. And from that point on, he basically lives like Poppaea. It becomes the emperor's. But Nero also calls him Sporus, which is Greek for spunk. And it's a typical Neronian joke because, of course, he doesn't have any spunk.
Yes.
And this is a very young boy. I mean, he's probably 12, 13, we don't know. I mean, it's hideous.
But
hideous.
Just to intervene there, those of you who watch Succession, did anyone here watch Succession, the series? Well, do you remember the story of Sporus?
Do you know how they got hold of that?
From you.
I am the Julio-Claudian advisor on Succession.
Amazing.
Very proud to say.
Amazing. That's amazing.
So Jesse Armstrong from Brixton, where I live, and he invited me in before the writers had begun work on Succession to talk over the Julio-Claudians. So I went and talked about all the greatest hits. And the moment I started talking about Sporus, I could see them all going, oh, that's great. And I was kind of thinking, hold on, isn't this about the Murdochs or something? I mean, how are they going to work that in? But they do.
Well, it's just another imperial dynasty, I guess. Yeah. So to continue the story, because Sporus, he lives way beyond Nero, and obviously it's not surprising that he comes to a sticky end, as it were. But will you just tell? Perhaps you can just tell those few years of political history through Sporus, because it's so interesting.
Yes. So Nero, I mean, all these kind of Neronian shenanigans. The mass of the people kind of like all this stuff. It's seen as a tremendous bans. But the elites kind of think this is terrible, and enough members of the elite out in the provinces decide that something has to be done about this, that they raise the standard of military revolt, and Nero is frightened by this, flees Rome, finds that the praetorians, the guards in Rome have turned against him, and commits suicide. And Sporus is with Nero and plays the role of the mourning wife over his body, kind of tearing her hair. I don't know what pronouns to use. What pronouns does one use? There, yes. I'm going to say his. Tearing his hair, rending his clothes and all this, behaving like the mourning wife. He is now a kind of trophy because Nero has been to bed with him. And so if you can go to bed with Sporus, then you're going where an emperor has been. So the head of the praetorians, who has betrayed Nero, grabs Sporus and treats him, as a concubine. The leader of the praetorians overreaches, and marching into Rome comes Galba, this guy who is the anti-Nero. He's very, very old-fashioned. He thinks that the Romans have gone soft. He thinks that they've had too much bread, too many circuses. They need to man up and get back to their ancient ways. And of course, this goes down with the Romans like a cup of cold sick. So 2 weeks into the year of the 4 emperors, he's dead, toppled by a guy who had originally been Poppaea's husband and close friend of Nero, and Nero had taken Poppaea off this guy and packed him off to go and govern Portugal. So this is a man called Otho, and Otho has hitched his wagon to Galba because he sees a way back to Rome. They turn up there, and Otho thinks that he should be Galba's heir. Galba refuses because Otho is a kind of, he's a fashionista. He wears a toupee. He depilates his legs. These are all kinds of things that Galba sees as being absolutely pernicious and Neronian, so refuses to back him. So this is why Otho launches his coup and ends up the second of the 4 emperors. And Otho takes possession of Sporus, because of course Otho had been married to Poppaea.
Poor Sporus.
So, yeah.
This is just horrible, isn't it?
So Sporus ends up with Otho. Meanwhile, up on the Rhine, where you have the heaviest concentration of legions anywhere in the empire, the legions there are saying, well, we're the bee's knees, we're the elite, we're the crack troops. We should be nominating an emperor. So they do. They nominate one of their commanders, a guy called Vitellius, who is famously fond of pies. And Tacitus has a tremendously bitchy description of wagons rolling across Italy and making the whole peninsula shake with the number of pasties from Greg's and deep-fried pizzas and things that are being brought to him. And Vitellius, his armies defeat Otho. Otho commits suicide very nobly, very bravely, actually. So despite wearing a toupee, he actually shows that he is an antique Roman after all. But Vitellius comes down, and he now takes possession of Sporus Poppaea as a trophy of war. But he decides that really Sporus has been around too many people. He's used goods, doesn't want this poor boy. And so he comes up with a tremendous wheeze, he thinks. Vitellius is keen to get the Roman people on his side. He wants to appeal to them. He wants to give them a treat. So the treat that he decides he's going to give the Romans, he is going to have Sporus dressed up as Persephone, the daughter of the goddess of the harvest who gets abducted by Hades, the king of the dead, and taken down into the underworld. He's going to have Sporus dressed as Persephone, and he's going to have a team of gladiators dressed as Hades. He's going to put them all in the arena, and he's going to have the gladiators gang rape Sporus to death. So, unsurprisingly, Sporus at this point commits suicide. And this is, it kind of brings home the collateral damage of those who are trampled underfoot by the very, very powerful in this world. But I think the most sobering and unsettling aspect of that story is that Vitellius thinks this is going to make him popular. I mean, you can't imagine Rishi doing that.
No.
Or Keir Starmer.
No, but
it's not the kind of... that's what I mean.
That's why Romans are very different.
That is why the Romans are very different, yes. Yeah. And in due course, Vitellius is toppled, and a terrible fate is visited on him, because Vespasian, this great general who's been suppressing the Judean revolt, he's got all his legions. He makes a throw for the purple, and does it so successfully that by the end of the year of the 4 emperors, Vitellius all his support has bleached away, and he gets found, supposedly, the story goes, hiding in a porter's lodge. And he's dragged out and made to walk through the forum, and he's casting his eyes down because all around him his statues are being toppled, and a guard puts the tip of a sword underneath his very, very double-fat, double chin. So he has to watch it, and then they haul him up the steps that lead from the forum to the top of the Capitol, where the story goes that he's sliced into little bits, and his decomposing body is just left there, and then someone comes with a hook and drags it off and chucks it in the Tiber. So it's quite a hardcore story,
stuff.
I think.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. I'm still stunned by this story of Paul Sporus. But anyway, to go back to the beginning of the book, It starts with the great Emperor Hadrian visiting the Tyne, and which, on the trip where he ordered, I think, the Hadrian's Wall across. And that brings us to the fall of the sycamore on Hadrian's Wall this week, the horrible vandalism.
Yes, which I think is quite Roman. The investment, the sense of a place, maybe a tree or a spring or a grove, having a kind of a sacral power, and therefore for that reason people investing in it emotionally in a way they might not otherwise do. I think that I've been quite surprised how much emotional investment there's been in that particular tree.
I know, people have mourned it more than they have people being killed in the streets of London.
I was reading one of the policemen saying, I've never had to investigate the murder of a tree before.
Yes, yes. But you've been spending a lot of your time on the Tyne or the Tweed up there, haven't you? You've moved up there a bit.
Might have come into possession of a Scottish estate.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, so my wife's father died, and he has a house on the banks of the Tweed. We thought, let's keep it.
Yeah,
so
yeah, wonderful.
But it's such an amazing part of the world because it's, literally on the border with England and Scotland. Is that
part of the reason you started with Hadrian? Is that part of the reason you're inspired by Hadrian particularly? Because he does seem to be your favourite.
I've walked Hadrian's Wall 3 times. Yeah. And actually, probably my favourite ever holiday snap is when I, rather than take my family on holiday to, some sun-kissed beach, I said, let's walk Hadrian's Wall. It'll be brilliant. You'll love it. Such fun, honestly, kids. We went to Newcastle and we started at Wallsend and began walking along Hadrian's Wall. And we'd gone about 5 minutes and it began raining. And it just got heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 5 miles on, we'd reached Byker. No trace of any Roman antiquities whatsoever.
Was there a Praetorian rebellion?
No. They just sat there looking miserable and bedraggled. And I've got this brilliant photo of them all looking so sort of wet and sad and depressed. But I wasn't. I was absolutely aflame with the love of classical scholarship.
Of course
you'll be pleased to hear. Because I knew what they didn't, that we were approaching one of the key sites in the history, not just of the wall, but of I think you can make the case for the empire as a whole. Because this was the hill by the Tyne where in the Middle Ages they would build a new castle, so hence Newcastle. But back in AD 122, this is where Caesar had come, Hadrian, and he had come to basically to start the building of his wall. And he had to offer up sacrifice to the ocean, because that was, Britain set in the ocean, and he had to offer up sacrifice to the Tyne itself, to the kind of the god of the Geordies. So he did that. And he builds this fort where the castle would go on to be built. And he calls it Pons Aelius, the bridge of Hadrian, because there is also a bridge. And the thing that's striking about that is that, so far as we know, this is the only bridge outside Rome to have the name of an emperor. So there is also a Pons Aelius in Rome. It crosses over to what's now the Castel Sant'Angelo, the great kind of fortress that guards the approach to the Vatican. That was Hadrian's mausoleum. So that was fine. To name a bridge after yourself in Rome was fine. But why is he doing it, the northernmost limits of the empire? And I think it's because Hadrian is making a statement with the wall. The wall is not a defensive structure. It's not about keeping angry Picts and Scots. It's a massive statement of contempt for the people who lie beyond the wall.
And inspiration for Game of Thrones, of course.
Well, it is the inspiration, because George R.R. Martin is on a holiday, on a kind of motoring holiday in Britain, and turns up at Housesteads, which is just, not far from where the murdered sycamore stood. And he goes there and he stands on the wall and he gazes out towards the north, and he imagines what it would have been like to be a soldier standing there. But he's imagining, White Walkers and mammoths and whatever coming, and this great wall of ice. But for Hadrian, actually, that's not what it's about. He's not afraid of what lies beyond it. He despises it. So the wall is like the gates of a massively wealthy gated community. He's saying, you know, north of here with your iron brew and your midges, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. You're not worth conquering. But everywhere south, this is the garden of the world. So it's, you know, this, in the New Testament, the parable that Jesus says about Dives and Lazarus, the rich man in his palace and Lazarus, the poor man at the gates. And in the New Testament, there's all kinds of nonsense about, you know, Dives going off and being burnt and Lazarus being taken up to heaven. There's none of that in Hadrian's cosmology. Hadrian is Dives, and the barbarians are Lazarus, the poor man, you know, with his sores being licked by dogs. They are to be kept out. They are to be despised. They are not allowed into, you know, the equivalent of Cliveden. That is how Hadrian sees the empire, as something beautiful, and to be allowed to live within it is a privilege, is to be civilized. To be without it is to be nothing, is to be lost to barbarous darkness. And that is what Hadrian is saying with the wall. And that, I think, is why he attaches his name as he does, both to the bridge and, I guess, to the wall itself.
Now, we've got 70 minutes left, so everyone, there are millions of questions to ask, and millions that I haven't asked and want to ask, but we're almost out of time. So everybody start thinking. I'm going to ask you two very quick ones, and I want quick answers.
Right, I'll do my best.
First of all, you're very famous for The Rest is History, which is a delight which we all enjoy and admire. Just in a nutshell, how did it come? How on earth did it come about? And do you regard it as often people say these podcasts are supposed to be like two men in a pub having a chat, but you don't strike me as the sort of man that does have chats in pubs.
Don't I?
No.
Well, I don't know whether to be flattered or insulted by that.
You should be both, but you should answer the question, but not too long.
Okay, how did it come about? It came about because Tony Pastor, who was head of ITV Sport and set up a company called Goalhanger with Gary Lineker, and they were doing Match of the Day and football-focused and cricket-focused and sport. But he is from Malta, and he read a book by my brother on the siege of Malta in the Second World War, and approached my brother and said, would you do a podcast on the Second World War, which my brother then did with Al Murray, the comedian, and it was a great success. And on the back of that, Tony said, you know, would I come in? And we had a discussion, you know, what could I do? Would it be Roman or ancient or whatever, or should it be the whole sweep of history? And I said, well, if it's going to be the sweep of history, I should do it with my friend Dominic Sandbrook, who is a historian of modern America and Britain. And so that's basically how it began. But it was a time when, I mean, literally everyone was doing a podcast. I mean, if you weren't doing a podcast, why weren't you doing a podcast? Was very much the attitude.
Good
so that's how we started doing it. And obviously we're kind of thrilled that it's done as well as it has done, and very surprised, to be honest.
Last question, and everyone start thinking of your questions now. The last question is: this ends with the death of Hadrian.
Yeah.
Are we going to have the Antonine, the adoptive, the rest of the adoptive? What's the fourth of your Roman quartet going to be?
It depends if I am spared. But if I am spared, then my ambition ultimately is to reach the point where Rome becomes depopulated during when Justinian, the emperor in Constantinople in the 6th century, sends his armies to Italy to reconquer it from the Goths who are ruling it.
God, that's going to be a lot of books.
It is.
Maybe 10 books, probably.
The aqueducts get cut. They you know, the Romans and the Ostrogoths furiously fight over Rome, and at one point the erstwhile capital of the world is completely depopulated. And I thought that would be a wonderful end point, because it would take us back to the beginning of the story with Romulus again, when there had been no one living among the Seven Hills. So that's my ambition. As you say, I mean, it requires me to stay alive quite a long time probably to finish that. But yes, so I would like to do next a a book that will cover what the empire is like under the Antonines. Because the great thing about the Antonines is basically nothing really happens. And then go into Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, and then up to...
Okay.
And then do the 3rd century collapse, Constantine and his dynasty, and then the final implosion. So
Brilliant.
That's my hope.
Right, questions, everybody. Let's go. Starting here with this gentleman.
Your counter-narrative on Titus. Could we have that to counter Simon's description of him as a horrible man?
Oh, yes. Well,
No, I quite like him, really. But,
well, the thing that's amazing about Titus is that it's very hard to think of a figure from history who has such two diametrically opposed opinions. So Suetonius, in his biography of Titus, says that he was universally regarded as the favourite of the world. Everyone adored and loved him. Whereas the Jewish tradition is that he is a terrible monster. He destroys Jerusalem, and there are stories about how a kind of midge goes up his nostril and he breathes it in and it grows and becomes a kind of hornet with a beak of iron and bronze that pecks away into his head and drives him mad. And then in hell he's every day being burnt and being reconstituted and burnt again because it mimics the burning of the temple. So you have best ruler who's ever lived, worst guy who's ever lived. I mean, you've got to make your choice.
Right,
or maybe neither.
Next question, please. This gentleman here with the, yeah. And then the lady at the back afterwards.
Thank you very much. Tom, the greatness of Rome was built through the Roman Republic over about 400 years and then was strangled as the Roman Empire became probably too excessive and too militarized. Do you think that the Roman Empire itself, the time of the emperors, represents a decline of Rome after the Republic? And do you see any analogies between that and what may be happening now that we've had 400 years of democracy in Europe and there's been an attempt to strangle democracy in the United States?
I mean, it depends how you measure decline. If your measurement is freedom, then yes, there clearly is a decline. But if your measurement of success is the ability to send legions to distant lands and conquer them and tax them, then Rome under Augustus and his heirs does far better than the Republic. And ultimately, without the autocracy that Augustus establishes, I don't think that the empire would have cohered at all. I think that it was in the process of implosion, and I think one of the measurements of the way in which Augustus ranks, in my opinion, as the most astonishing and successful, certainly figure in Roman politics, but very possibly in the entire history of Western politics, is the fact that he is able to stabilize an order that otherwise is in the process of complete implosion and put it back together again and establish a framework, a system of rule that endures with the odd blip, AD 69 being one, pretty much continuously for 200 years. And of course, the Roman Empire lasts right the way up to the fall of Constantinople, and even beyond that, the fall of Trebizond. So, I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that Rome starts its decline with the collapse of the Republic. Is Western democracy therefore doomed? I mean, we are so different. We're so different. I don't think that there are kind of hard rules like that. But what I will say is that hard-baked into many republican systems in the West is a recognition of Roman forebears. So that was very clearly the case, say, in the French Revolution. But it was even more clear, perhaps, in the American Revolution, which saw the expulsion of a king and the establishment of a republic, and a capital city that has a Senate and a Capitol Hill, exactly like Rome. And that's why I think the United States is haunted by the fact that the Roman Empire fell, but also the fact that the Roman Republic fell. And there's quite a lot of that kind of language at the moment with the next presidential election kind of hoving into view, anxieties about particularly Trump, I guess. But these kind of anxieties have been expressed continuously, even right from the beginning, when Benjamin Franklin came out from the Great Convention that was establishing the Constitution, and people asked him and say, well, what is our system of government to be? And Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. So even then, Franklin was worrying about this stuff. So I hope that's a kind of cheery answer.
Very cheery. Okay. Yeah. Okay. At the back there.
Hi, my name's Charlotte Eager. I am a classicist, although it was rather a long time ago, but I like to keep up with it. And my specialist subject was the kind of, in history, was the end of the Republic and the rise of the Julio-Claudians. A result of which, obviously, Claudius is one of my favourite books and TV series, and they're running it again on the BBC at the moment. How true would you say it is, particularly in the character, I know you can't comment on the entire thing, but the characters of Livia and Claudius, how realistic would you say that was?
So, for those who haven't seen I, Claudius or read Robert Graves' novel, it tells the story of the Emperor Claudius, and it's imagined to be his autobiography. And Livia is the wife of Augustus, who in the novel and the TV series, Sean Phillips plays her brilliantly, is the ultimate kind of Machiavel. She is the power behind the throne, and she manipulates and schemes to ensure that her son Tiberius will succeed. And every time her husband Augustus appoints an heir, they mysteriously die of poison or in some mysterious accident. And the sense that she is, the great puppeteer of the Julio-Claudian court is brilliantly done. I think that is a fiction. I don't think that anyone could be such a. I don't think that she's doing that. But having said that, I do think that she is a very, very powerful and probably frightening figure. Augustus clearly depended on her very, very fundamentally. And I think that in public, she's the model of kind of moral rectitude. I think in private, she is indisputably very deep and devious. But beyond that, it's hard to know because there's a fog there that we can never hope to penetrate. Claudius is, I think, a much less sympathetic figure than Robert Graves portrays him at. The thing that always sticks in my mind is that in the arena, the games, I mean, to be very simplistic, you can divide it up into 3 thirds. You have the executions, you have the beast shows, and you have the gladiatorial combat. And for most people, it's the gladiatorial combat or the beast shows that are what you want. A too big a fascination with executions is seen as being vulgar. Claudius loves the executions. That's what he's famous for it, and people comment on it. And it's felt, it's a bit vulgar. And from our perspective, it's kind of, this lovable Derek Jacobi guy, and he's sitting there cheering on as people are put to death in baroque and hideous ways. I think he's probably not as nice as Derek Jacobi makes him out to be.
Okay, I think we should, just this one, and then I think we should. Last question.
What are your thoughts on integrating? Because for a while, I had the luck to study Latin, but it's currently it's still a very elitist subject, and sort of classics. It isn't very integrated into the education and sort of the state sector, and I think that's a real shame. Do you think it's on the way to being integrated more, or do you think it should be?
I think that there's an excellent organisation called Classics for All, which has as its goal the training of teachers and the funding of the introduction, mainly of Latin. I mean, very occasionally of Greek or of classical studies into state schools, and that is actually having. I mean, it's all relative, but it's having some success. I think Latin is the 4th most studied language in state schools, after French, Spanish, and German. So that is quite a feat. And every historian, when he or she has a book out, will say the subject of my book is the most important topic. And it's disgraceful that people in school aren't studying it. I am going to be very self-disciplined and try not to say that. because basically there is so much history, there are so many languages, there are so many things to study, and in schools at the moment, the demands of STEM are so overwhelming that I think it's a struggle just to keep the humanities vaguely alive, full stop. So I wouldn't go, obviously I have benefited so deeply from studying these ancient languages, and I feel that my life would be immeasurably poorer without having done that. But I did that because I was obsessed and fascinated by them, and I would probably have done it anyway. And I think that, you know, again, the same is true of history, that people are always saying, well, why aren't we studying this? Why aren't we studying that? People need to study that. I mean, the truth is that if you are fascinated enough now, what has changed is that there are now enough resources that you can go out and do it. You can do it online. There's, you know, the whole library of the world is at your fingertips. So I think that probably the role of education, you know, in state schools, as in the private schools, shouldn't be so much to give you knowledge that you can then... The knowledge itself is less important than teaching people that you can go out and source the knowledge. If you want something, go and get it. It's better to be curious, I think, than to be stuffed with facts, would be my feeling. And I think that that has to be the future for humanities in a school education system where the emphasis on maths and science and engineering is going to be so great that people have to be encouraged first to recognise the infinitude of fascination that there is in history and in literature and the humanities generally. And secondly, that if you feel curious, there are so many options that you can take to pursue it. Because I don't see any other way in which that can happen. You know, it's a pipe dream to imagine that state schools today could ever go back to the condition that was in, I don't know, Rugby or Winchester in the 19th century, where everyone was studying Latin and Greek. That's never going to happen. But it is possible if you want to, and I speak as someone who taught myself Greek, it is possible to go out there and do it if you really want to. And likewise, if you want to study whatever period of history you think should be being taught in schools, you can go out there and study it yourself. And that realization, I think, is one of the most, you know, we have so much about what is negative about the internet and the explosion of social media and all that kind of thing. But the absolute positive is the opportunities you have to engage with it.
We're just running out.
Sorry.
I so agree with that. Brilliant. Brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, we need a drink. And everyone should buy this book and everyone should read it. And Tom will be kindly signing copies, won't you?
I will.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
to Tom.